So today we're actually going to go through like the structure of the nervous system itself. So like the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the nerves outside of that. The actual structure of the nerves themselves are the same or similar to what we did yesterday, but obviously each part has a different role in what we feel and how we think. So that's where we're at today. So the first thing I want to do is go through the central nervous system and the parts of the brain. You guys are probably somewhat familiar with some of these parts. Do you remember what the four major parts of the brain are? Nope? Okay, excellent. Well, then you're going to learn something. Whoa, that was cool. The biggest part of the brain and the part that you usually think about when visualizing a brain is the cerebrum. It's the largest portion of the brain. It's the top portion. So it's all of this right here. Okay. Then the second largest part is the cerebellum, which is down here. And I'll talk about what each one of these things does individually. Then you have this part right here in the middle. This is actually one of the very first parts of the brain that develops as a fetus. It's called the diencephalon. The diencephalon. And then down below that is the brain stem. Obviously, this is probably the first thing that develops because this area is going to control vital functions like heart rate and respiration rate. So those things develop pretty quickly as a fetus. Okay, so when you look at the cerebrum itself, the cerebrum is actually divided into left and right hemispheres. The weird thing is, and you might have heard this before, the hemispheres control the other half of the body. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And those nerve impulses cross over right at the junction of the spinal cord. They cross over. And I don't know what the purpose of that is, but that's what it does. And you can actually control these movements with the brain when you use like an electrical probe and you stimulate particular areas of the brain. It will cause contraction of those muscles that they control. So you've probably seen the kayak commercial, not like the boat kayak, but the travel site kayak, where the guy is doing brain surgery on somebody, but he keeps touching stuff on his brain, so the guy's typing to look for travel plans for him. And you can actually do that, which is kind of cool. Okay, so then if you get a look at the side view of the cerebrum, there are 4 different lobes of the cerebrum. So technically there'd be 8 because you got each individual hemisphere. You have the frontal lobe, which is towards the front of the head, which is right here. And this is the area that controls judgment, decision-making, a lot of higher-level thinking things. Okay? At the very back top portion of it is also where motor function is controlled. So in reality, the area that controls all of your muscle movement is just right here, down this band right there. The speech areas are located on the sides, and there's actually a separate spot on there for interpreting words. So in one area, you interpret language. In another area, it controls speech. So sometimes, like stroke victims, if they have a blood clot or an aneuritic stroke, depending on which type, and the cells are affected around the speech area, they may start talking to you and absolutely making no sense. The area of the brain that controls language is functioning perfectly normal. So they know what they're trying to tell you, but it comes out with random words. And so that would be one sign of a stroke. You also have other signs like facial drooping. Maybe the person can't speak at all. But it would be very, very frustrating to be that person that is saying something and then throws in random words that make absolutely no sense. Yeah.
Isn't there like something where if there's this person that like had a stroke or something happened and they woke up and they could speak a different language?
Whoa, really?
Yeah, I've read it.
Never heard that.
Is that possible though? I feel like
I would think you'd have to learn the language. I mean, you'd have to store the language in your memory somehow. That'd be awesome. Well, it wouldn't be awesome if you had a stroke or anything. That would be pretty cool if that's all it took to learn a new language. But I haven't heard that. So, okay, so that's the frontal lobe. The next lobe is the parietal lobe, which is on the top, kind of back portion of the brain. This conveniently sits with sensation right next to motor function. That makes sense because, yesterday we talked about putting your hand on a hot burner and then all of that information being relayed to the brain and then motor response back down to your bicep to make you pull your hand away. Because they're located pretty closely together, the pathway there doesn't take very long. So there's pretty quick response and communication between body sensation and motor function. Taste is also processed right on the side of your head. And we can see these things if you take an EEG, which you have all the fancy electrical electrodes hooked up to you, right? And they can see the different areas of the brain light up when you're doing different activities. So that's how they can really tell what part of the brain is being used during different activities, like speaking, or in this case, when you're processing taste, that area of the brain lights up. It's kind of cool. The lobe below the parietal lobe is the temporal lobe. Okay. Yeah. You can see there it is. This is about the only sense that makes sense because hearing is processed in this area and it's right next to the ears. The rest of these are kind of jacked up as far as where the location is where they're processed. Like taste, for instance, you'd assume it'd probably be closer to the front, but it's not. The occipital lobe is in the back. This one really doesn't make any sense. But that is basically entirely dedicated to vision. And we use vision, we're very dependent on vision for a lot of things that we do. But so the optic nerve runs all the way from your eyes clear to the back where we process vision. And that's why if you hit the back of your head, you oftentimes see stars because you've affected that area of the brain when you hit it like that. Okay. Down below that, and this isn't part of the cerebrum, but that's the cerebellum right there. Okay, which the cerebellum is its own little entity, but it controls balance and coordination. So again, if you hit the back of your head, you may get up and you may be, like your balance may be all screwed up. Part of that may be vision. Part of that is probably from cerebellum issues. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. All right, so the peripheral nervous system then is everything outside the brain and spinal cord. And we'll break that up a little bit more down the road. I'm guessing I'm going to run out of time. So we talked about the cerebrum already. Higher level thinking all takes place in the cerebrum. We talked about the two hemispheres. Okay, and there's those 4 lobes. You should learn these. Okay, frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital.
Just the names are like what they.
You probably should have a general understanding of what each one does. Yeah. Do you want me to keep that up there?
No.
I don't remember if I had it in the notes or not. When you look at the cerebrum, you tend to see like these bumps and then little valleys in between those bumps. Okay, that would be the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer. Most of that is composed of white matter, which means those neurons have myelin on them because it's fat. If you think of looking at a steak, right? The marbling of a steak is white in color. That's the fat layer. When you get down into the cerebral medulla inside the brain, that's mostly composed of gray matter. Those are unmyelinated cells, unmyelinated neurons. Okay, so we talked about that, white matter. That's way out of backwards. That's not right. Okay.
The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain. The folds on the outside of the cerebrum give it a large surface area. This is important because this layer is only 2 to 4 millimeters thick and holds the billions of neurons that handle higher level sensory and motor processing. The cerebrum is divided into 2 distinct halves or hemispheres. The right and left hemisphere communicate through a connecting band of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. Without the corpus callosum, the right side of your brain would have no way of knowing what was going on in the left side. The cerebrum is also divided into lobes. Although each of the lobes handles a variety of processes, there are some differences. The frontal lobe tends to be in charge of reasoning, planning, and problem solving. It contains many of the language areas, as well as those for movement and emotion. The parietal lobe deals more with sensations, such as touch, pressure, temperature, or taste. The region of the cortex that processes sound can be found in the temporal lobe, while things you see are primarily processed in the occipital lobe.
Okay. The diencephalon, which is the part that's like right in the middle, just below the cerebrum, is highly involved in hormone control, okay? Because it's going to play a huge role in like emotions and moods, hunger, thirst, reproduction, all of those different areas that are really important. It's also the location where your thermostat is located. Okay, and that is important because when you get an infection, your body actually turns up your temperature on purpose. And that's because bacteria and viruses tend to grow at a temperature of 98 degrees, just like our bodies are normally set at. And if we can elevate that temperature a little bit, it slows them down. And that gives our white blood cells, our immune system, a chance to launch an attack against them and fight it. So ultimately, taking ibuprofen and stuff like that to lower your temperature isn't always the best thing because your body's doing that naturally. Now, obviously, it can get a little out of control, it can get too high, and it's not very comfortable. And so that's a good reason to take those things. But ultimately, it's all controlled by our own thermostat. Okay, the brainstem. This is an area of, for the most part, it's communicating from the spinal cord to the brain, and then it also sits there like the midbrain is going to connect different parts of the brain so that you can interpret different inputs to make sense of your environment. For instance, my vision is going to need to talk to judgment, things like that. Like if I see this stool that I'm walking by, my judgment should tell me, yeah, you probably shouldn't trip over that. You probably shouldn't walk right into it, right? And I can see it, and those things together then will tell me, okay, I probably should walk around. Okay, does that make sense? So all those neurons have to be able to communicate somehow to put together the big picture. One of the really important ones is the medulla oblongata. I love that saying. say that word. The medulla oblongata is the thing that's going to control vital functions. By vital functions, I mean it's going to control all of the involuntary actions that we talked about before. So it's going to change the diameter of your blood vessels, to change your blood pressure. It's going to tell the heart to beat. It's going to control respiratory rate. It's going to control vomiting, sneezing, coughing, blinking, all of the reflexes that we don't have to think about, that we just do. Now, there's a lot of times where we can override the medulla oblongata to a point, because the higher levels of thinking, the cerebrum, can say, well, we need to hold our breath right now. So you hold your breath. But ultimately, at some point, you're going to pass out. And the medulla oblongata is going to take back over again and control that respiratory rate. Okay. Oh.
Is there anyone here?
Uh-oh.
Tell me why. Is there anyone here? Tell me why most alligators are abnormally dressed. Anybody? Anyone? Yes, please.
Mama said that alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
You guys see this?
Mama said alligators are ornery because they got all their teeth and no toothbrush. Wow! Anybody else? Yes, please.
Alligators are aggressive because of the large medulla oblongata. It's the sector of the brain which controls this.
That is correct. The medulla oblongata, the medulla oblongata is where anger, jealousy, and aggression.
He's actually wrong. It's the thalamus.
Anybody can tell me where happiness comes from.
The big medulla.
Anyone? All right. Let's hear what Mama has to say on the subject.
Mama said that happiness is from last grade of sunshine that comes down when you get blue.
Well, fools, Mama's wrong again.
Don't call us sad, if you're wrong. Mama's right.
Mama's right. Wrong is medulla oblongata.
So Colonel Sanders actually was wrong. It's the amygdala in the diencephalon that controls emotions, moods, anger, aggression, all that stuff. But just
The brain stem is one of the oldest parts of the brain. It takes care of many of the activities we don't have to think about, such as breathing, jumping if we hear a loud sound, or deciding we're hungry. The upper relay center, the thalamus, directs most incoming sensory signals and outgoing motor signals to and from the proper regions of the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, located just below the thalamus, directly or indirectly controls much of the body's hormone production. It is involved with the regulation of body temperature as well as basic drives associated with mating, hunger, thirst, periods of rest and activity, pursuit of pleasure, and avoidance of pain. The midbrain is an important relay center for visual and auditory information. Regions in the midbrain help control things such as pupil size, eye movement, and motor response to sound. The pons serves as a relay center between the cerebral cortex and the medulla oblongata, between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, and between each side of the cerebellum and the opposite side of the cerebrum. The medulla oblongata, the lowest portion of the brainstem, links the rest of the brain with the spinal cord. It also controls various homeostatic activities such as heart rate and breathing.
Okay. So we did talk about the cerebellum. It's going to help you detect and interpret data from your body as far as like where your limbs and stuff are at in relation to the rest of your body. It feels tension on the joints. And so it can tell the brain, you don't have to see that your arm is bent, right? You can feel that your arm is bent. We kind of take that stuff for granted, but there has to be a part of the brain that can sense that and detect that. And that's the job of the cerebellum. And so that's why if you have brain damage to that portion of the brain, you lose capabilities.
The cerebellum receives sensory impulses from muscles, tendons, joints, eyes and ears, as well as input from other brain centers. The cerebellum smooths and coordinates ongoing movements, such as walking, by timing the contraction of skeletal muscles, allowing a high degree of control over movement.
Yeah. Nobody can stand like that. Okay. The spinal cord runs between the vertebrae, and it's actually relatively small. You have the vertebrae around them to help protect them because obviously that's vital information. And anytime you have a spinal cord injury, nervous tissue has a tendency not to be able to repair itself well. And so if you kill cells within the nervous system, they typically don't grow back, and you've severed the communication from that point on. And that's why the higher the damage is, the worse the results are. If it happens in your neck, very likely it leads to death because that's a lot of those nerves are going to vital centers. Okay? The farther down you go, then you may be quadriplegic, where you can't feel or move any of your limbs. You go down further yet, if you sever it at some point below that, maybe you're paraplegic, where you can't feel or anything below your waist. So they're coming a long ways with research on some of this stuff. Stem cells are cells that can become any cell in the body. And so there's a lot of research being done now to see if you can do a stem cell transplant into the damaged area, and those stem cells will take over the job and replace the damaged nerve cells. If you can re-wake that communication between all of those things, perhaps you can actually have someone that's paralyzed be able to feel and walk again. All right, I'm going to stop there for today just because I don't want to get into the peripheral nervous system and then the bell rings. So you really don't have anything that you have to do for tonight. And I will stop there.
What time do we get out of this school?
I don't awful.